This is Doug DeMuro, and today we're going to talk about my favorite 1980s performance cars. I have a list of my top 12 in order favorite 1980s performance cars, so let's get to it. Before I get started, be sure to check out Cars and Bids, which is my enthusiast car auction website for cool cars from the modern era with free listings. You can list your cool car for free and auction it on Cars and Bids. And we've had some fantastic sales recently, including this wonderful Mercedes E63 AMG wagon, which sold for just under $41,000. This amazing FD Mazda RX-7, which sold for just under $34,000. And this great Dodge Durango SRT Hellcat, which brought $80,000. If you're looking to buy or sell a cool enthusiast car from the modern era, Cars and Bids is the place to do it with daily auctions, free listings, and great selection. Check it out at carsandbids.com. Okay, so 1980s performance cars. Now the 1980s have kind of a rep for creating some really cool performance cars because they created a few really special ones. But the truth is, the 1980s, in terms of automotive performance, it was largely an extension of the 1970s, which is to say, not that great of an era. You know, the 60s were sort of a heyday before regulations and the fuel crisis, and the 70s, everybody knows, kind of the malaise era, not great cars. But the 80s, things weren't really kicking back into full swing until the early 90s, and then like the XJ220, the EB110, the F40, the McLaren F1, all those cars started to show up. The 80s, again, not really that great if you really think about the cars that were built in that era. So I've made this list of my favorite 80s performance cars, but again, there's not as many as you'd think, but I've made mine and I put them in order. Okay, so number 12 favorite performance car of the 1980s, the BMW Z1. This is maybe the only car on this list that isn't on here because of its performance. Not that it was bad, it was like a little convertible based on the E33 series, but of course the cool thing about the Z1 was the doors. These trick doors that would go down, and that's how you climbed into the car instead of opening on a hinge. They were so cool and so neat. And I've driven a Z1 with the doors down, and I just think it's one of the coolest little roadsters that ever was. What a little fun idea. Not only are you open to the world, but the doors go down and you're open on the side too. It's just such a cool car. Again, it didn't drive amazingly. It was based on the E33 series, which was a great driving car, but the Z1 wasn't incredibly fast, and it was expensive because these doors weren't cheap. But it was a cool idea, and I've always liked that car. And that came out in '89, just fits into this. And so it's one of my favorite 80s performance cars. Okay, next up, number 11 on my list of favorite 80s performance cars. It's actually two vehicles that served a very similar purpose. The original Volkswagen GTI and the Peugeot 205 GTI. So these were some of the original hot hatchbacks, high performance hatchbacks. This is one thing the 80s did well. So the 70s showed us, hey, fuel is gonna be an issue. You start thinking about emissions, you start thinking about fuel economy, because there's this fuel crisis. Cars have to get smaller. This was true globally. Engines have to get smaller. So how can we still enjoy cars like we did in the 60s, but in this new era of fuel? And the answer was hot hatchbacks. They were practical and they were fun, just like, you know, some of the old muscle cars with big trunks and big back seats, but now they were fuel efficient and enjoyable. Now, this was primarily a European thing, but these cars, a lot of them, the GTI at least, did sell in the United States and a few others, and they were just great. By modern standards, they're not fast or powerful, but by the standards of that era, where like in the 70s, the Corvette had like 120 horsepower, these things were like a real hit. It was like, wow, I can have fun and still, you know, have a smaller, fuel efficient car. And they were fun to throw around, they were tremendously exciting to drive, and these were great cars. And the 1980s kind of birthed us this awesome segment of car that still continues today with great popularity among enthusiasts. Okay, next up, number 10 favorite performance car of the 1980s, the Audi Quattro. So Audi came as a brand, kind of came back on the scene like the 60s, 70s. They were building kind of boring cars. And they decided, hey, look, we need to enhance our rep and our image. We need to get something more exciting going on. And so the Audi Quattro was born. It was a rally car that went rallying and was very successful. And it had these flared 80s fenders that looked cool, this cool coupe design, although it was a hatchback. And of course, there was the Sport Quattro too, short wheelbase, although those are $1 zillion. But I always thought the Audi Quattro was just one of the coolest cars. And by modern standards, once again, the performance is not really particularly impressive. It's fun to drive, and it's especially fun to look at, but it wasn't like a fast car by today's standards. But back then, it came out in the very early 1980s, went basically throughout the whole decade. Back then it was cool. It was awesome looking, and it really helped to put Audi on the map as like, hey, this is a real brand that's going to threaten Mercedes and BMW, kind of foreshadowing what came later. But it was a very successful rally car at the time, made into a very cool street car, and they have become desirable and expensive. Okay, next up, number 9 favorite performance car of the 1980s, the Nissan Skyline GTR, the R32 model. I owned an 89 or a 90 Skyline GTR, and I loved it. It was a great car to drive. It was a lot of fun, very exciting. So to create this car, Nissan takes the Skyline, which was a fairly standard Japanese sedan and coupe. They took the coupe version and they made a performance model with a turbo 6-cylinder with wide fenders, 4-wheel drive, 4-wheel steering, and a lot more power. And they were all manuals and they were all fun. And it's an amazing car to drive. My only gripe about the R32 GTR, the one that I owned, all of them were right-hand drive. They didn't make a left-hand drive version because they only really sold them in Japan. And so it's not the most practical in a left-hand drive country like the United States. But if you could put up with it, it's tremendously fun to drive. That RB26 powertrain is incredibly responsive, potent, feels great always. Reasonably reliable too if you don't try to tune the car to 1 zillion horsepower. And I loved the R32 GTR, and I think it's awesome and fun and kind of emblematic of what started to come next, especially from Japanese performance cars as they grew in insanity throughout the 90s. Okay, next up on my list of favorite 80s performance cars, number 8, the E30 BMW M3. This actually followed a similar lineage as the Skyline GTR. They took a fairly standard but somewhat sporty BMW, which was the 3 Series of course, and they made it more fun. They put a wing on the back and these wide fenders, better suspension, more power, and it was a fun car. Not only that, it was sort of the beginning of the genesis of the M brand. This car came out basically the same time as a few other M cars, but it kind of told BMW, hey, enthusiasts want this stuff. This is how you can put yourself on the map as the brand that builds the ultimate driving machine. And so the E30 M3 was a tremendously special car. It came out, it did really well. It was a sales success, and it's just plain cool. These days, nice E30 M3s have gotten so expensive with their 215 horsepower 4-cylinder engine that it seems like it's a lot of money for not that fast of a car. But the point of that car was never about the speed. It was always about the chassis, the dynamics of the E30. That was the coolest thing about it. It was lightweight, you could throw it around, you could have fun with it, and it was great. And I always loved the E30 M3, and it's hard to find them in nice shape anymore, but they're around and they're special, and it deserves a spot on this list. Okay, next up, number 7. Favorite 80s performance cars, the Dodge OMNI GLHS. So this goes back to earlier, the GTI, the Peugeot 205 GTI. This was a high performance hatchback, but it was done in American style. So they took a Dodge OMNI, which was generally agreed to be a terrible compact hatchback that again was a response to the fuel crisis in the 70s. And they said, hey, these Europeans are making these performance hatchbacks, let's build one too. So they made the GLH, which stood for Goes Like Hell, and it had a turbo 4-cylinder. And then they decided to make an even more powerful version called the GLHS, which apparently was Shelby tuned, and so the S maybe stood for Shelby, although people used to joke that it stood for Goes Like Hell Some More. I've heard that many times. I don't know what the actual truth is, but you had a high-performance American hot hatchback. Now, the quality was trash in these cars, and back then turbocharging was such a new technology, especially for Americans and American mechanics. Nobody really knew what the hell to do with this thing and how to maintain it and how to operate it. And so they were not popular to begin with, and then they were not maintained well, and then they were modified and blown up. It's very hard to find a nice OMNI GLHS today, but probably my all-time favorite hot hatchback. I just think it's an incredibly cool, special car, made in incredibly low numbers, mid to late 80s. with this sort of Shelby tuning behind it, and it was a very, very special, weird, obscure, cool 80s performance car, an American hot hatch. So number 6, my favorite performance cars of the 80s, we're getting down here now, the Buick Grand National. I love this thing, and actually it's fitting to talk about this around the OMNI GLH and the GLHS, because throughout the history, General Motors performance cars were all about big, powerful V8s. But the fuel crisis also forced General Motors to kind of rethink that. And so they came out with a few turbo performance cars in the 80s and early 90s. Of course, we all remember the GMC Cyclone and the GMC Typhoon, which were turbo performance versions of the GMC small truck and the GMC Jimmy SUV. But they also made the Grand National, which was a turbo V6 version of the Buick Regal. And it was like a high performance, all black turbo V6 Grand National. It's so cool. Now, I drove one of these recently. I don't even think this would be as high on this list, but I drove one of these recently and it is so cool. Like, it's just, oh, I think it is one of the coolest cars. It sounds good, it looks amazing, it still feels pretty fast by modern standards. I love the Grand National, and I really think, short of the supercars that came out of this era, this is one of my favorite 80s performance cars. It just had the look, the muscle, the feel, and it sort of foretold the era of turbo performance cars that came next. Okay, so number 5 favorite performance car of the 1980s, the Lancia Delta Integrale. Delta Integrale, one of my all-time favorites. I actually especially loved the Evo 2 version, which I think was like a 91 or 92 or even a 93 model, and so that's kind of getting into the 90s. But the genesis of the Integrale Evo was definitely all about the 80s. The hot hatchback road had been paved by the GTI and the Peugeot 205 GTI and cars like that. There were others too. But the Integrale took it to the maximum level at that time. The later Integrale Evos had over 200 horsepower. Compare that to like low 100s in the early GTI and the 205 GTI. Had these massively wide fenders, big wheels, wing on the back, and it looked awesome. And it was a rally car. It was really a rally car that had been, you know, kind of converted for road use. It was like the ultimate hot hatchback. If the Volkswagen GTI and the Peugeot 205 GTI kind of paved the way, the Integrale Evo destroyed the road. I don't know, that's a stupid metaphor, but you get the idea, right? Like, it took it to the next level. And I drove an Integrale Evo for a video maybe 3-4 years ago, and it was so much fun. And I've always known it to be an amazingly fun and thrilling and exciting car. I've also always been afraid of maintaining and operating one, which I think is reasonable, but it is so cool and so special. And it was an absolute icon of this era of cars. It was the the GTI was the hot hatchback that started it. The Integrale was the hot hatchback that everybody wanted and still wants. Okay, down to the top 4 favorite performance cars of the 1980s. And it's these 4 cars, specifically kind of the top 2, but these 4 that really give the 80s a rep for being a great era of performance cars, even though they really kind of weren't. But number 4, the Vector W8. The W8 was a ridiculous supercar that was made by an American company called Vector. And it used kind of a modified, I think it was a General Motors engine in the back. It was massive power, ridiculous car. And it had the craziest styling of any supercar in the history of the supercar. And I sincerely mean that. It was absolutely out of this realm insane. And they only made like 10 or 12 because there were all these problems with funding and getting the cars on the road and blah, blah, blah. But they were so cool. And I reviewed one of these maybe 4 or 5 years ago, and the video blew up as it deserved to. It was a very special car that not that many people know that much about, but everybody's always wondered. And now we know, thanks to this kind of in-depth video I did. But it was a bizarre car with a lot of aviation technology, and I mean, it probably would have been the coolest 80s supercar if they had gotten it off the ground and built more of them. They were automatics, which was a little disappointing, 3-speed automatics in fact, but they were still awesome. And I truly think the greatest looking or at least the most crazy looking supercar ever. Okay, next up, number 3, favorite performance cars of the 80s, the Ferrari 288 GTO. This car has become tremendously desired over the years. The lore of this car has always increased as it's gone on. It was 1985 model year. Ferrari built 272 of them with a turbo V8. And the evolution of this car sort of became the F40, which is maybe foreshadowing on this list. But the 288 GTO was, it was interesting because it wasn't really priced like a supercar when it came out. It was priced sort of similar to the 308 and the Testarossa, I think almost in between the two, like $90,000 when it was new. Now they cost $3.5 to $4 million. Part of the reason is everybody wants the 5 Ferrari supercars, the 288, the F40, the F50, the Enzo, and the LaFerrari, and so you gotta get a 288 to have the collection. But also part of it is just like this was ushering in the new era. You know, Ferrari had this amazing heyday in the 60s, the 250s and the 330s and the 275s, incredible cars. And in the 70s, things kind of slowed a little. There weren't that many special Ferraris. In the 80s, the return of the 288 GTO signified Ferrari was back. They were ready to start making the craziest cars in the world again, and this was sort of the beginning of that run. And very rare, very special car. Like I said, 272 units, incredibly rare. And it's neat. It looks cool. I think it's the most beautiful of all the Ferrari supercars. And it was the beginning of an era for Ferrari that has carried to this day and become like this magical thing in the Ferrari line. Okay, next up, number 2, favorite performance cars of the 1980s. This one is obvious, the Lamborghini Countach. Very special car. Countach came out in the late 70s and it was sold through pretty much like 88, 89. Like it was the 80s, you know, in supercar form. And I think the Countach is one of the reasons why people talk about the 80s as being so great for performance cars. Oh, the Countach, that 80s look. The truth is there weren't a lot of good supercars or exotic cars in the 80s. But the Countach was so iconic that it's kind of convinced people that the 80s made great cars. Really, it made kind of one great car. And the Countach isn't even that great. It's got a horrible driving position. It's loud, smelly, loud. You can't see out of it or in it. I mean, everything about it is horrible, but it is one of the coolest looking cars ever. And it's rare and it's special. Lamborghini built under 2,000 of them. They're really desirable cars. And I have always absolutely loved the Countach. And frankly, everybody has always absolutely loved the Countach. It is one of the ultimate automotive icons in the supercar world in history, and it easily deserves this number 2 spot. And it's only number 2 because number 1 is the Ferrari F40, which was the very tail end of the 80s, and again a signal that, hey, supercars are back. The stuff of the 60s, these amazing cars, we're gonna do them again. So Ferrari built about 1,300 F40s between 87 and 92, and it's, I mean, the most iconic Ferrari, probably the most iconic modern car. Truly amazing, special. Everybody knows everything about this car already. Turbo V8, you know, Enzo's last car that he signed off on and approved, blah, blah, blah. It was so cool. And it has only become cooler as, you know, time has gone on, and these cars are so special today. And so even though the F40 sort of bridged the gap between the 80s and 90s, it did come out of the 80s, and it really kind of signified, hey, performance cars are coming back, and here's the ultimate one. And even today, it's still viewed that way. So those are my favorite performance cars of the 80s. You might wonder about some cars that aren't on the list. So I'm going to talk about them very briefly. Porsche 959, not on the list. In my mind, a little too obscure. Never really loved how it looked. Tried to do a lot of stuff with the lifting suspension, being a luxury car and a supercar, and it's just really low production. You know, the market values F40s higher than 959s, even though there are 6 times as many F40s. And that kind of tells you everything you need to know about the 959. And it's a special car, but it's weird and obscure, and it's kind of an if you know, you know sort of thing. Nissan Z. I love the Nissan Z, but my favorite Z cars were the Z32, which was early 90s to mid 90s, and then the 350Z, which was like 03 to 08. The 80s Zs are awesome, and they had some cool digital stuff, and one day I hope to review a really nice one and kind of talk you through it. But in terms of performance, it was fine, it was good, but it wasn't like light your hair on fire, not like some of the cars on this list. Lamborghini Jalpa was Lamborghini's entry-level supercar from this era, and again, it was fine, like the Ferrari 308, also not on this list, with 328. They were great cars, they were cool, they looked awesome, they were wedge-shaped, but when you think about the pinnacle cars, the Countach, the 288 GTO, the F40, those are the ones that deserve to be on the list. Mazda RX-7. The FB and the FC RX-7 came out in the 80s. I like those cars okay, but I really love the FD, which was a 90s car. And so to me, that was the RX-7. And these cars are kind of, the earlier ones are cool, but not as cool. Testarossa, very special car, but again, you want the pinnacle cars on your favorite list. BMW M1 is not on this list. That car was built from basically 79 to 81. It really bridged that turn of that decade. It's a cool car, but again, I've always found it sort of obscure. Performance isn't amazing. And honestly, BMW didn't really become a supercar manufacturer, so that car has always been a little orphaned. So it's fine, it's cool, it looks cool, it's neat, but I'm not obsessed, never have been. Last car that isn't on this list that maybe should be the Fox Body Mustang. I love a good Fox Body. They look cool, they just got brute power, they're stupid cars, they were cheap speed, and I really always liked that. Especially really liked the Fox Body Cobra. So maybe those, although that may have been early 90s. That must have been like a 91, 92 type car. But regardless, a good Fox Body is an awesome car. And I guess let's make that number 13 on the list. So 12 favorite 80s cars plus now number 13, a big V8 Fox Body.